That Triathlon Show 201. Hey, what's up everybody, and welcome back to another episode of That Triathlon Show, the podcast presented by scientifictriathlon.com. I'm your host Mikael, and on today's episode we have a Scientific Triathlon coaches get-together where James, Lachlan and myself get together to discuss the topic of base training. This is one of the most asked questions I get from listeners for the Q&A podcast, and even more so, I think, from customers of our training plans when they have finished their plans or finished their last race of the season or their key race. What do I do now? Do I just restart the plan, or how do I do this base training thing? So what we'll try to answer today, which is quite timely as most of you in the Northern Hemisphere at least are getting into this time of year when you're done with your season races for this year and next season's races are months and months and months away. So now the question is, what do we do with those months? And hopefully this episode will shed some light on that question. Just as a quick introduction, regular listeners, of course, will already know James and Lachlan as they've both been on as guests in past episodes, which we'll link to in the show notes. And also, if you follow our Instagram or Facebook pages at Scientific Triathlon HQ, then you will have seen their athletes' race results in our weekly race reviews. So you will know that they are brilliant coaches, as evident from the results that their athletes are having in those races. And finally, if you don't remember, both James and Lachlan are themselves elite level triathletes. Before we get into the discussion, big thanks to our sponsors. First, we have Precision Hydration. And there is a great blog post on the PH website that I read recently called Salt and the High Blood Pressure Hypothesis. And this article discusses appropriate salt intake guidelines for sedentary people and how they are different compared to what good salt intake guidelines should be for athletes. And this goes especially if you're a heavy sweater and a salty sweater. For example, Andy Blow, who wrote this article, says that he can lose around 6,000 to 8,000 milligrams of sodium in a hard 2-hour run. Compare that to normal salt intake guidelines in the UK and the US, which say that you should consume between 2,000 and 2,500 milligrams per day. So this goes to show that you can quite quickly become deficient or in a negative sodium balance if you don't do some changes to how you think about sodium as an athlete compared to a sedentary person. So that was an interesting article, and there are tons of great content on the Precision Hydration website. Definitely check it out. And also check out their free online sweat test if you haven't already to get a hydration strategy for your next race. You can try your first box of electrolyte product for free with the promo code ThatTriathlonShow, all one word, all caps, on precisionhydration.com. And big thanks to Roka. Roka has, as you know, world-leading products in wetsuits, tri-suits, swim skins, goggles and high-performance eyewear. And in that last category, eyewear, one of my favorite Roka products is on the eyewear side, and it's the Aviator sunglasses. And the backstory to these sunglasses is a pretty interesting one. It all started with Jesse Thomas rolling up to the famous wildflower race in California, and for whatever reason that I actually can't remember, not having any sunglasses for this race. So he rolled into a gas station, brought up $5 and bought a pair of Aviator sunglasses there and raced in them, ended up winning Wildflower. And this later on became the catalyst for Roka Optics and their goal to redefine the standard in both style and performance. And on the performance side, you have unmatched optics and patented Geeko Fit technology, non-slip. You have excellent lightweight materials and all sorts of really, really high-tech stuff that make these sunglasses so excellent. You can get 20% off your order on Roka.com with the promo code TTS, all caps. So without any further ado, let's get into the discussion with James Teagle and Lachlan Kerin about base training. So James, Lachlan, welcome back to That Triathlon Show. How are you guys doing?
Yeah, I'm good, thanks. Yeah, just ticking off last year race of the season, and obviously coaching, last Northern Hemisphere athletes through their last races, and some of Southern Hemisphere athletes are starting to think about their race season. So it's an exciting time of year.
Yeah, I'm good as well, thank you. I am at the other end of the spectrum a little bit in the sense that I just had navicular surgery about 3 weeks ago, so halfway through the non-weight bearing phase. Back doing a bit of swimming personally, but certainly putting a lot of focus on the rehab at the moment. And from a coaching point of view, very much in the same position. A lot of athletes now moving into off season and kind of that base phase. But obviously the Southern Hemisphere athletes are just ramping up with some big races coming up soon.
Yeah, and that was one of the triggers for making this episode, that a lot of the questions that started coming in for Q&A episodes were about that off-season or base training phase. So rather than just having endless Q&As all about the same topic, I thought that we might do a big episode together about that and discuss some of the intricacies of what to do and what not to do. So let's start by just laying out some definitions. So how would you define a base training or the off season in terms of how long it lasts, when it starts and when it ends? James, why don't you take this one?
So off season is essentially for me the time when after your final race, you take your break, which anywhere from a week to 2 weeks for the athletes I coach, and then into like a preparation to training phase. So essentially, you take that break, and then you're kind of, that's there for like the mental side of things, the physical side of things, getting you ready for next year. Then you've obviously you've stopped training, so you got to get back into training properly, and that is the prep phase for my athletes. So essentially, getting moving again. Maybe some very very light intensity sessions, that kind of thing. Then you're into a base phase, which is anywhere around 8 weeks. And I class all of this as off season.
Yeah.
And then even the build phase after that, which is building up to race season. You're looking at another 8 weeks there. That's still off season for me. And the off season kind of finishes when your first race is less than a month away. So you're really doing that race preparation phase. So for me, yeah. So just to clarify, that's from your last race for the season all the way until around a month out from your first race is basically what I call your off season.
Yeah. And Lucky, what do you have anything to add to that, or any thoughts around that?
Yeah, I suppose I do agree in that kind of sense, but I guess there is two distinct phases, as kind of was mentioned. I do like that phase of moving away from swim, bike and run for a little bit. Anywhere up to a month, I think, can actually be good for some athletes. But yeah, kind of 2 weeks at a minimum at my end, and that comes from I've also spent, and I'm sure you guys have as well as an athlete, many years not taking that break, and it can be a scary thing, I guess, for some people, and for a lot of us to kind of move away from the sport for over 2 weeks. It can feel like you're losing all that you've worked for, but I don't think it's necessarily the reality. And I guess I term that base training is when we kind of come back into a more general week of training that we kind of use before we get into the true preparatory phase for a race.
Yeah. I would just I agree with both of you. The way that it's all really details or semantics where we might have different ways that we term things, etc. What I like to do is to, like as you guys said, have that time off, and for me, I would say that 2 weeks is the minimum for most athletes. But I do think that some athletes that train a lot, like if the training load is high, then they can benefit from more. Most of my athletes will have 2 weeks off though, so it's rare to have more than that. Then the off season starts with just a 4-week phase where the training load, as James said, is light, and you're really building into it, and really many athletes get frustrated because they want to immediately dive into doing really hard work and start to build their fitness. But I think it's important to take that sort of transition period, and I really call it transition, that phase. And then the really long phase of the base training is, I like to use the traditional periodization terminology here and call it general preparation. and that really depends on when the athlete's first race is. I like to call the phase between the general preparation and the first race is specific preparation, and that can last 8 to 12 weeks depending on the athlete and the race. And after that, we had a competition period. But for me, the base training is really that transition period, at the time of the transition period, and the general preparation, which for many athletes, if they start racing in June and they start to take their time off now, the general preparation period might be as much as 5-6 months almost. So it can be quite long, but that depends on when your racing season starts. For you guys, James, for example, that race the World Cups, European Cups, and those sort of races, then the season is so long that obviously it's going to be much shorter than that. So that's just the terminology that I use around the base training. Let's move into sorry, go on.
I was just going to interrupt there and just say, like that true off period that we've all kind of talked about. We're kind of talking about moving away from swim, bike, and run, and I don't think it necessarily means you have to just sit on the couch all day and eat chips. I don't think any of us are advocating that. It's just a time to go and do some other things that you kind of have neglected during that time. Even the top athletes are still time poor. Everyone only has 24 hours in a day. So it's a really good opportunity to go out and try some different things,
I think part of it is just that mental break. It's a long way to next year. Basically, if you think about when you're taking your break, you've got to race until this point next year. If you're doing your last race this weekend, so that's part of it, and I completely agree with there with you, Lucky. Lucky, I've got a question for you. If your athletes were taking their break, say you're giving them a month, would you encourage them to not do any training at all? I mean, if they want to go for a little run, is that a problem or?
I tend to agree with.
Carol, sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to say I tend to agree with Michael in the sense that I'd like to see at least 2 weeks of no swim, bike, or run. To be frank, and then if in that next 2 weeks we're bringing back anything, I'd really much prefer it to be to just be some technical work in terms of the swim. And I guess for probably people where I live in Australia, it's for the guys who live up north and stuff. Even winter, it can still be 20, 25 degrees. Very tempting to go out and do it. I guess if you live in Norway or Finland where it's dark and cold, then your run's going to be on a treadmill. It's probably easier to resist.
Yeah, I mean, because you hear all kinds of things, and I've heard people who have come and trained with the squads I've been in who have been actually quite annoyed that we've been doing a bit of training over in that period. Whereas obviously other squads and other people would take that time completely off, like you say. So I think it's just quite interesting to hear the different approaches to that. I think personally, for me, it's just you just got to. The mental break is what's important. So obviously there's a physical break as well, and as long as you're not training too much, I'm talking hardly anything. I don't see a massive issue with doing a bit, but obviously, that's kind of against the purpose of a break. So if you want to do a bit just for enjoyment and for social, that's fine. But I wouldn't approach it through like training for training's sake, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, look, I was just going to say, look, I've never, I heard plenty of people say, I didn't have enough of a break, but I don't think I've ever heard anyone say, oh my God, I shouldn't have taken that 4-week break when they're 6 months down the track.
Yeah, that's very true. Yeah. I definitely had.
I think from that mental break side of things, what really happens is that if let's say your coach gives you a 3-week break where you're not allowed to swim, bike, run, you can do some other things. Let's say you live in Scandinavia, then why not go out and do a cross country skiing workout? It doesn't have to be a hard workout, but just go out and be active, as you said, not just sit on the couch and eat chips. That's not the point. But by getting away from that swim, bike, run, when you're coming to that end of the 3-week break, you should feel like a little bit. I think that like you're really almost climbing the walls of the house, and you really want to get going again. You should have that like burning motivation to get started with swim, bike, run, because it's going to be a long season, and if you're not like super motivated at the start, then it's going to be difficult to keep up even like a normal level of motivation when you get towards the end of it. But also for the physical side of things that you talked about, James, I don't think we should underestimate how important that side is to have a slightly longer break in terms of adapting to the training load over an entire season, basically. Because I think we often can make the mistake of assuming that, well, we might train for 2 weeks hard or 3 weeks hard and then take 1 week easier. And during that easier week, we're going to adapt to all the training we did. But I'm not sure that always happens. It really, because we build up so much training load over time that it's not necessarily the case that we always adapt to everything. And we might need that longer break to really give the body the chance to actually adapt to all the training that we've done. And of course, we also lose some fitness in the acute sense, but in the chronic sense, from a long-term view, I think that having that longer break is going to allow us to really absorb and adapt to that training load we've done almost the entire previous year.
In terms of like the loss of fitness, this is a conversation I've had with a few athletes, and like you say, it's not something to really worry about too much. If you think about how far away race season is, at some point you're going to have to let your body recover, and like you say, physically as well. Try and get over any niggles and stuff you got as well. Maybe that's the kind of time of year you want to take it really easy. You don't want to push anything. So for sure, I mean, it is just kind of getting through that period, not training too much, not worrying about loss of fitness, and not worrying about, if you put on a bit of weight actually, because, your race season's, a long way away. And, you got plenty of time to lose it. So I think, and then going back to that mental side, just enjoying life again, like you say, like you and like you both say, doing something a bit different, maybe going cross-country skiing or something. So that kind of thing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. So if we move on to the next topic on our list that we have here, the objectives of the base training phase, what do you think of that? What are the different things that we really want to achieve during this period?
Look, I think ultimately we're trying to, get the athlete to a point that come that specific race prep, we've built their, aerobic capacity as high as possible. And I guess once we get to that race specific phase, that's when we really have to, consider, how we're going to race and those race pace, like what is race pace, before that, I guess what I like to think of it is, I do like to keep the athlete, with a fair bit of different stimulus through the base training phase. I don't think that it's all about just simple low intensity. I think that is a bit of a thing that people fall into. Yes, I think the majority should be, that low to steady kind of effort, but I still think that, we need to keep intensity in there. At the same time as well, I think it's a really, really good time to work on the technical aspects of all three sports, really. Swimming's obviously the most obvious, where we can make some big gains with working on those technical weaknesses. And then probably the run. And on the bike, I guess, how much of it is technique, it's not really kind of that obvious in terms of pedaling efficiency and things like that. But for those that can ride outside, great opportunity to practice some skills. And also, things like working on your position, if that is something that interests you. It's a really good time to, if you're on the trainer in somewhere that is cold and wet and dark, it's a good opportunity to work on that position with someone who knows what they're doing and get your body used to it and see, compare power numbers and things like that. So I think that at the start of the base training phase, that's what we want to look at. From there, I do like a fair bit of strength work within the swim, bike and run. So that's pull buoy and paddles in the swim is a good way for that. And then, low cadence work on the bike, I've found, anecdotally to work very well for a lot of athletes. But, if we're looking at why, I guess, we've talked a lot about VLA max on this podcast, and that's a really good way of bringing that down. So it's a great way to do that. And then similarly on the run, where athletes can get hills and variable terrain, I think it's a really good opportunity to get out and just enjoy training for training.
Yeah,
James, what do you think about the objectives?
Well, I more or less, completely agree with most of it, really. I mean, in terms of intensity, yeah, I agree. It shouldn't be. You should have that aerobic stimulus as your main objective. So you're working the aerobic system. You're trying to get as much of an engine as you can, essentially, in this period. But yeah, I agree. I mean, it's got to be, it's got to be variable. It can't be boring. Saying the same thing, because you just get stale. You've got to mix it up a bit. And in terms of intensity, the athletes I coach are going to go through a phase of actually, building the intensity. So we start off very easy. We might start off with, like, in terms of a tempo run, let's say. So they might start off with just a long run, and then gradually we bring in a bit of work at tempo. So maybe just 10 minutes at the start, and by the end of the winter they'll have done a couple of sessions that almost an hour long if they're racing half Ironman. It's just that kind of build, the gradual build across the base period. So I think that's important. And, like, again, going back to the technique side of things, I think technically this is definitely the time of year to start working on things, especially around the swim. So in race season, you don't really want to be changing technique too much, in my opinion, because if it can slow you down. If you have to think about it, if you are doing those hard sessions, changing technique is not the easiest thing to do. So definitely this is definitely a time of year to think about really improving that technique, really focusing on your weaknesses, both swim, bike, and run. And then obviously you've got the gym as well. And I think it's the time of year in the gym to really make sure that you are robust, especially because the volume is likely to be quite high, especially at the end of a base period. So especially that first bit, you've got to make sure that you're working those areas in the gym that are going to make you robust, injury prevention, that kind of thing, just to ensure that your season is a good one and successful, and you don't have any big issues. I kind of think of this phase as it's setting up your year, it's setting up your engine, it's setting up how robust you can be, it's setting up your technique. It's basically, it is what you don't really see in race season, but kind of is the background behind it, the scaffolding, if you like.
Yeah, I guess like the crux of what we're both saying really is that we're just aiming for consistency across this period as well. So for most athletes, that really means that early on, as you start back training, the load has to be just total volume wise, significantly less than what you were peaking at, during your top level training in the previous season. So that is about just being really patient. But if we can build that consistency week in, week out, that's what makes strong athletes season on season. And I guess what's been talked about on this podcast a lot is that when we talk about intensity, it doesn't have to be a lot of intensity. Like even just something like strides on the run can be so valuable. And I guess you guys agree with that too.
Yeah. I have a note here about the intensity, and what I like to see as an objective here is to keep in touch with all your energy systems and all intensity levels, but that doesn't mean that you do massively hard workouts or anything like that. So instead of during your racing season, if you do a VO2 max interval workout, you might do 5 times 4 minutes would be a really big one, a really hard one, but that's something that you might do. Whereas in this phase of training, you might do something like 8 times 1 minute, and you might have 1.5 minutes of recovery on the bike, for example. So it's not a lot. It's 8 minutes of work, and the recovery is long compared to the intervals. But you're just keeping in touch. You're doing enough to maintain it, and as James said, then you're working to progress that. But you're not necessarily going to extreme specificity or either on like one single system. You want to develop them in some sort of balance, and of course it's going to depend a bit on the athlete and the athlete's needs, their limiters, and what their goal event is. But during this phase, you're not necessarily looking too much at, am I going to do an Ironman or a sprint triathlon, because there are basic things that endurance athletes need regardless of the race distance. So you want to of course develop your aerobic system a lot, but you want to work on some top end aerobic capacity, and you also want to work on some anaerobic capacity. So basically having some sort of balance, which is dependent on the athlete, but doing a little bit of everything, not at the same time necessarily, but making sure that you get in a little bit of all those different systems.
Yeah,
and then as you guys said, yeah, sorry, go on.
Oh, sorry, I was just going to add in there. Just I thought it was a good time to one of I guess Dan Lorraine speaks about it a bit, but is kind of within that longer ride, just something like a 7-second sprint every 20 or 25 minutes. That's a great little stimulus to have in there, and it also is just good mentally as well.
Yeah. I was looking at Dan Lorang was in Lisbon here last autumn and had a seminar, and we got some slides from there. So I was looking at that actually in preparation for this episode, because he had laid out his basically by week the themes of each week examples of how they lay out the season, so what they're working on each week with the long distance athletes. It was quite interesting. But yeah, he definitely has a lot of good points. So that's an episode that people can go back and listen to. I do have one more thing that I wanted to add, and it's about the foundations that you both mentioned. So one was being injury and niggle free. I think that this is one of the reasons that taking the time off again is very important, because it allows you to get rid of those niggles and sort of reset your body, and as well starting out with a much lower load, as you said, Lucky. The volume is going to be much lower. But also I think see a physio, like even if you don't have any issues, this is the time to definitely go and do that. Incorporate strength and conditioning. Ideally, you might want to see a personal trainer a couple of times to work on your form for what program you're going to use through the base season, to make sure that that's on point and that goes along with the technique and the movement quality in the free disciplines, but also in the strength and conditioning that you do. And then finally, just general health. So making sure that at this time not at any time, of course, but really this is time to really not skip on sleep, and having a good balance between training and the rest of the things that you do, because you might get away with skipping on sleep for a few weeks when you're really in your peak volume phase. It's not recommended, but you might get away with it. But if you do that throughout the base training phase, then you might be a star in February, but in July you will be cooked. So I think that sleep is something that is, and balance in general is something that is really important to keep in mind in this period, and just the general health, and having that goal in mind that you shouldn't overtrain in this period. You're trying to be good during summer, during the racing season, not in winter in the base training season.
Yeah, I totally agree. And look, I guess I wrote something on this quite a while back, but in terms of, this isn't the time when you're starting back. We've talked about this just now, is like you do expect to put on a little bit of weight. And I think, now is not the time where you're looking to be in an energy deficit. You're already loading up your body with, some more volume than it's had for the last month or so. And, it needs to have the kind of energy available to be able to handle that and recover properly. So as we start back building this volume, it's not the time to be trying to also lose weight and get to race weight, 32 weeks out from your main race.
That's interesting, because I would actually say, from my perspective, it's easier to do it during some time, not necessarily immediately as you get back into training, but during some period of the base training phase, rather than doing it in the race phase, the competitive phase, or the specific preparation 1 or 2 months out from the race, when you really ramp up your training. But it's you do make a great point there. At the same time, I just think that if you're really going to be more on the racer's edge during that closer to the racing phase. So from that perspective, I see the base training phase as a good time to, at some point, and I'm not saying, yes, you can put on weight, but maybe when you get to the latter parts of the base training, so you get into February, March or something, you're still not at the racer's edge in terms of training, but you have already built up that consistency. So maybe totally, that's the time when you start to work on body composition.
Yeah,
right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I totally agree as well. I mean, it's I agree with Larky. I mean, at the start of a base, the start of your off season, I think you should put on a bit of weight. You've probably been at race weight. Your immune system's probably going to be a bit depressed. You come in towards, especially Northern Hemisphere, the winter period. There's loads of bugs going around, all that thing. You don't want to be in an energy deficit. You want to keep that consistent training through. And actually, it doesn't really matter if you put on a bit of weight, but I think you kind of got to break it into 2 periods. So I kind of see that point before Christmas as it's fine to put on a bit of weight. And then after Christmas, you're starting to think about race season is coming. So, just start thinking about, eating well, not overdoing it on, the Christmas pudding and things after Christmas, and just, gradually bringing the weight down. But I'd encourage my athletes, I've had this conversation with a couple of athletes I coach, that, not to worry too much about weight. Just see what happens. Whatever happens. Just don't focus on it. Because, as you say, you want to be in tip-top shape for race season, but it is a long way away.
Yeah, that's a really good point of breaking it down with before Christmas and after Christmas, because I think that nobody should need to be really saying, no thanks, I don't want any of that delicious Christmas food because I'm worried about my race weight. That's not healthy in any way. So that's a good way to break it up into two different parts, like putting on weight before that, and then maybe you start to be a little bit more focused on it, if that's something that you even need to focus on. That's not necessarily something that all athletes need to focus on, but some athletes might have that as a goal, which is a relevant goal and a good goal for them to lose a couple of kilos for the race weight. But yeah, not hurrying into that too quickly.
Yeah, that's kind of where I was coming from. Is certainly, yeah, just get that that general week kind of in swing before you start thinking about that too much.
Yeah. All right. So let's move on to the next point here. So what methodologies I guess do you have when you structure your base training in trying to achieve these goals that we talked about? Can you break that down, starting with James this time?
Okay, so what methodologies? So basically, your base training period is you're coming off that period of having your time off. So the first thing I'd say is, methodology wise, we want to start pushing on your fitness, and this is kind of the ideal time of year to measure your fitness, because in race season, you got all these races, you got things getting in the way. So actually, the first thing I'd do is I'd start off a couple of weeks of training, then I'd do some testing just to see where you're at. And if your races next year are long distance races, you're trying to work on that kind of really top end of the aerobic system, not top end. If you're trying to work on the aerobic system, then that's kind of what we're trying to build on, trying to build through that consistency. The first few weeks probably won't have much specific aims. It's just getting that consistent training done, and then after 8 weeks you test again. Has your general fitness increased? Has your LT1 moved on? Where you're running a faster 20-minute time trial? Are you swimming faster in the pool? That kind of thing. And then just keeping testing every few weeks. Training should be progressive, and you should aim to tick off those sessions. So whatever your goals are, this is the time of year to just like we said before, get that consistency in, and just work on the general fitness of the aerobic system ready before you go into anything too specific. In that later phase. Does that make sense?
Yep, absolutely. Lucky, what are your takes on this?
Yeah, look, I tend to agree. I mean, if we're talking about the sports that anyone listening to this podcast is doing, no one's going to be harmed by having a better aerobic capacity. So I guess that's what we're always looking to do, is develop that aerobic system. As James kind of mentioned, we also need to consider what events we're actually aiming for. I mean, there's going to be some distinctly different challenges for someone doing draft legal sprint distance than there is for doing, an extreme Ironman triathlon. So, if it is that extreme Ironman triathlon, what do we have to consider? Well, it's a very good time to get out and run trails, for instance. I think one thing that does get lost a lot for a lot of athletes, kind of at all times of year, to be honest with you, is easy swimming. I think that for a lot of athletes that go to a squad or a masters session, it can actually end up being that year round, every session is focused on intensity. And I know I've spoken about this before, but I think there's a place in the program for kind of long aerobic swimming. I kind of interested to hear what you guys think on that.
Well, it's interesting because James, you worked with me, helped me as in a sort of consulting role throughout this summer, and the thing that we discussed in one of our calls, I remember, was that I wanted to improve my cycling and running and just maintain the swimming that I had built up. I felt to what for me was a good level in my race in May, and I just wanted to maintain that. And then what you suggested and what we did is to do quite a lot of just aerobic swimming. Quite a bit of it was at the higher end of the aerobic swimming, so sort of like LT1 effort. But that's what I've been doing basically throughout the summer, and it's absolutely helped me maintain my swimming with quite a limited amount of intensity, to be honest. I've generally done like one session with a bit of speed, but those sessions aren't terribly taxing. So I might do like a couple of 50-meter sprints and then 6 or 8 25-meter sprints or something like that. And then one session that is more based around LT2 or something around that nature. So a more intense session. But then the rest of the sessions, 2 or 3 of them, would be just aerobic. Some of them higher aerobic, some of them just easy recovery and technique, and that's worked well. So completely agree.
I was going to say, so yeah, I mean, I think there's, going back to master sessions, especially if you're training, in a squad of just pure swimmers, there's that kind of temptation just that every session should be hard, and you should be pushing yourself in that kind of competitive environment. And when you go down to a master session, it's very rare that you do an easy master session. My experience is that it's kind of, does end up being a bit of a smash fest. So everyone just kind of ends up swimming, just below race pace for as long as possible, really. Unless the session's really specific, and you've got a coach that's really setting some guidelines there. So it's just be careful and just actually think about what you're doing in these sessions, especially if you've not got a coach prescribing those sessions properly.
Look, and I think when we're talking about methodologies, one thing that we didn't really talk about before is actually it's really important to break down the last season to this base phase. And actually assess that last season and kind of take stock about where our strengths and weaknesses were, so that we actually have a bit of a path forward as we start back. I know for us here at Scientific Triathlon, we obviously use the inside testing a little bit for some of our athletes, and I find that's obviously gives us a bit of a look, quote unquote, under the hood in terms of cycling anyway. So that kind of stuff is very valuable, but there's plenty of other measures. I think for most athletes, it's pretty clear where the strengths and weaknesses lie, and it's a really good opportunity to work on those weaknesses.
I think that actual break period is where you actually have time off is a really good time just to take stock of what has been holding me back this season. What motivates me, and all those little things that you can take into next season. Just take stock. So, for example, the athletes that I coach, I'm going to go over, and we're going to pretty much go over every race they've done this season. Okay, so what was the general things that didn't work out so well? What's holding you back? Is your cycling? Are you not running well off the bike or something like that? Those little things, and actually identifying them now so we can do something about them later. In addition to that, it's actually thinking about what motivates those athletes. So, actually, what are we training for next year? That's really important that we have those. And as I said, I'm linking this back to this question, how that actually fits into, what we're trying to achieve over this base period. So, and using what methodologies, because we need to have some aims for next season. If that all makes sense.
Yeah. Yep.
Oh, absolutely. And look, just to add to that, I think that, I know for a lot of my athletes, certainly when it comes to family and work, they can assign, an 8-week or 10-week period where they have acceptance from the family and whatnot that, training is going to take a little bit more priority. But through the rest of the year, we kind of have to understand that, training isn't going to have that same priority. So we need to make sure that we create a week that is actually achievable for the athletes and isn't going to be causing, other problems or adding stress that just can't be handled, because we need to kind of, look at the athlete as a whole. We even top pro athletes, unless you're in that top 10, 20, a lot of us are still working and, have relationships and stuff. And all of that needs to be taken into account, especially at this time of year, because, that 8 to 10 week race prep phase, you can maybe, ask for a little more leeway,
For
but
sure,
you can't be asking for that necessarily.
I'm just going to run
52
through
weeks a year.
the sort of structure or the methodology that I have to when it comes to planning what to do in the base training phase here. So a lot of the things you already mentioned. So looking at what races are coming up next season and what the goals are for those, but also looking back and taking stock of where we were and where we potentially fell short this last season and where the athlete currently is. So that is sort of the starting point of planning. And when I plan, I know that very few plans survive the first enemy contact. So things are going to change. I still like to put out a long-term plan, sort of almost like a periodization structure. Although I don't know that periodization is the right word, but just I guess it's just a plan. It's just sort of giving the big themes for what we will be focusing on week by week, and what's going to happen throughout the next half year or full year almost when we create this rough big picture plan. So anyway, the starting point for me is to just demarcate the different phases that I have, which includes the break, the transition, which is where we're really easing back into training, and then the general preparation period, which is the longest and biggest, which you can call basically base training, and the specific preparation, which is the last maybe 2 months before the first race, and then the competition season. I also include different strength training phases for most athletes that will be doing strength training. There are a few that don't, just because they are very limited on time, and then they will just be doing basically the same sort of home-based core strength and stability year-round. But most athletes, I do want to get into the gym, and then the strength training is periodized a little bit differently or alongside these phases. So that's also going into the plan. And then what I like to do as well is to block out specific weeks or periods where we'll have recovery, so lighter weeks. That again might change based on if things are coming up for the athlete, then we might move things around, but it's good to have a baseline structure for that. The next thing that I do is to look at the different disciplines. Let's say we have an athlete with a weakness in cycling, then I will definitely want to include some blocks where we focus more on cycling than on the other disciplines, and vice versa for any discipline. So basically charting out in which weeks or blocks we might be doing a little bit more of one discipline compared to the rest, and having that laid out in the plan. And then finally comes the training objectives. So in which phases are we working? And again, we are going to work a little bit on everything probably, but what is going to be the main focus of each block or each week? Is it going to be aerobic development technique? Is it going to be building into VO2 max or tempo work or something like that? So actually those are more the training types, but the aerobic development or technique or maintenance or anaerobic development, even for some athletes that are really low on that side, those might be the big training objectives that I would map out. And then finally, that breaks down into the different training types that we are using to achieve those training objectives. So for aerobic development, for example, we will probably be using quite a lot of work around LT1, just below LT1, and but then also including some of those lighter intense sessions, like the light VO2 max session that I mentioned, and gradually building those up. So that also goes into the structure. So that's basically how I plan out the entire year, essentially. Although typically the plan ends around the first race, then it becomes less or a bit more vague and a bit more open, because I know that things change so much in race season. And I will fully admit that no athlete has ever, we've never kept even 90% of the plan for any athlete. But if we can keep 70%, then that's already really good. And it gives, it makes sure that we have the big picture in mind at all times. And we hit the targets that this athlete needs based on where they are strong and weak respectively, and also what their event goals for next season are, etc. So that's how I sort of go about planning and the methodology I use when it comes to mapping this out.
Yeah, and I just wanted to touch on that point you made there about, that kind of recovery week. And, I think through this phase, sometimes it's really good to be adaptable with where that falls, in the sense that if a week pops up in someone's life that kind of dictates the need for that to happen, then that's a really good opportunity to pop that in, as opposed to if we're structuring it every X amount of weeks. I think what happens when you've got that busy week in one of your bigger weeks, it kind of is a really good opportunity to put those quote unquote recovery weeks in line with weeks where maybe you just don't have the time availability.
Yeah, 100%. The things change. It's just a starting point to have it mapped out like this. But yeah, you need that flexibility.
Yeah, absolutely.
Going back to that point earlier, I was going to say, I mean, that ties in exactly, like you just said. with having that mental break, and maybe making sure that you do prioritize family. Well, not make sure your family is getting what they need from you. Make sure your work's getting what they need from you, because like you say, you can't be training as you do in that race specific phase 52 weeks a year. So I think you got to kind of realize that this is the time of year where you go, okay, so maybe I've got a family event on or something, can I move something around? Can I do that swim session another time or something like that? And I think this is the time of year where you've really got to take the time to do that, just in terms of your general well-being throughout the whole year after that as well. You don't want to be taking all that stress through the winter period, because there's going to be plenty of it as you go up to race season. This is not the time.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's move on to the next point then. It's about how do we know that we are, and this is, I guess, especially important for self-coach athletes listening to this, how can they know that they're getting it right in the base training phase? What are some things to look out for to make sure that things are going well? What should they feel like, and how should they perform, etc.?
Well, in my opinion, if working with the coach, especially, or if you have a plan that you've created yourself, even, the number one measure is, are we actually able to hit the sessions? In terms of, if there's 10 sessions a week and we're hitting 4, and we're actually only completing 4, there's a bit of a problem there, right? We need to, first step first is got to be, are we actually have a program that's achievable? So I think that's your number one step, and that's that's a bit of give and take from the coach and athlete in terms of that can take a couple of weeks to really work out what is achievable at this time of year, especially if it's a new relationship and you haven't had that off season yet. And for yourself, I guess that comes down to being realistic with your time and energy available, like what you can actually do. In terms of how you're feeling, I guess, as you touched on before, Michael, sleep should always be a priority. But at this time of year, if you're only sleeping 5 or 6 hours a night, yeah, you're right, it's going to catch up with you in the long run. So if that means that you have to cut back to 1 session a day so that you get your 7-8 hours of sleep a night, then so be it. It's going to pay off in the long run, in my opinion. I'm sure you guys agree with that. We can't just expect to be walking around like a zombie. And I guess, there is a point in Ironman training where sometimes you do feel a bit like that. But it's just not sustainable year round. So we don't really want to be walking around, in that super fatigued zombie-like state at this time of year. I think that's probably really not a great sign. In saying that though, look, I guess, through the base phase is a time when, I guess, we do see people going to for some European athletes, it might be going to Mallorca for a week, or something like that. And I'm certainly not against that. I think having that be a kind of quote unquote overload week certainly has its place, as long as you give it the respect that it deserves in terms of recovery. In terms of knowing if we've got it right, I guess we can use performance measures, certainly, but I think I'm not sure that PBs is the way to go, but more so, let's set those zones and those performance measures at the start of the base training phase and see how we progress through it, as opposed to comparing everything to our best. Because if we're comparing everything to our best, the reality is early on, it can be pretty demoralizing, especially if you're already kind of towards the top of your ability. So I think it's about progression relative to where you start.
Definitely agree. James, what do you have anything to add to that? So yeah, I just buy into that again. So it is just it's got to be achievable, like you say, Lucky, for sure. And that achievability, has to come through, like we identified earlier. The consistency is really what is important through this period. So it's just consistently ticking off those sessions, and if the sessions aren't achievable, then that's not going to happen. So that for sure has got to be one of those things you've got to identify as, am I achieving these sessions? And if you're not, then the odds are you're not going to be very consistent, or you're not going to be very consistent with any sort of quality training. In terms of actually, like you said, you're not going to be hitting PBs, and I think athletes do worry through this period. I'm not so fit. It's not going so well. And it's just holding yourself back, because you got to realize how far away you are from race season, how far away you are from probably peak fitness. If you're hitting PBs in this period, actually, it depends on who you are, but you might be quite worried. Personally as a coach, I'd be, well, maybe we've pushed this a bit too hard, a bit too soon, because it's a long way to race season. So unless you're quite a novice athlete, PBs in this period, I'd be quite wary unless you've done something amazing or there's other external factors. We don't really want to be in peak form until we are hitting race season. So I just be wary around that. I think doing some testing, every 8 weeks or so, just to test those zones, just to make sure that you are improving, consistently. You're able to hit slightly bigger power numbers, that kind of thing. I think that's a good measure of are you improving, but generally, like you say, I wouldn't worry about comparing where you were, in race season to where you are over, especially that initial part of the base period.
Yeah, and look, when we're talking about testing, I guess, I think we would probably all agree that, yeah, sure, there's a lot of conjecture about a 20-minute test, and does it actually, is 95% of that really what we could hold for an hour? And from where I sit, it doesn't really matter. That's not what we're after. We're just using it as a performance measure, and in that sense, we can use it.
Absolutely, yeah. No, I think you're both spot on there. Like, we can use testing to see if we're progressing, but we shouldn't compare that to our peak numbers that we ever achieved. We should compare that to how we're progressing through this base training phase, and remembering at all times that we're not looking to be at our best at this time of year. We're looking to be at our best during the race phase. That's and you can't be at your best throughout the year. So staying patient, as hard as it is super important. And to add to the sleep factor that you mentioned, Lucky, I just think in general we should feel that we're not under too much fatigue. I mean, sometimes you are fatigued, sure, you might have some heavy training, but you shouldn't be right on the razor's edge at this time, even if which you can be when you're at that race-specific phase, when you're training, even if you're sleeping 7, 8, 9 hours, you can still feel like you're on the razor's edge. But this is not the time of year to really be pushing the limit, because that's, I think, when you might end up peaking in this phase, and then you don't perform as well in the race phase. And in addition to that, not being too fatigued, remaining motivated, I think, is really important. So, and if you're training a bit too much or a bit too hard, then that can be quite difficult. If you get the right balance, you should find it easier to stay motivated. And I guess that a good litmus test there is, do you always have a little bit left in the tank that you could do one more interval when you do your hard workouts? Then you're probably hitting a pretty good sweet spot there.
Yeah, I guess it's just about, noticing the difference between what is acute fatigue and what is, them becoming chronically kind of fatigued. And we want to avoid that in all aspects of life, not just training. We want to avoid chronically fatiguing any part, any part of it from any part of our life. So, acute fatigue is okay, as you spoke about, having a hard session and even a hard few days. But if it's every week we're just feeling more and more fatigued, then we've got to have a look at what's going on there, because it's easy to dig a hole.
On that point, I think, as you mentioned earlier, Lucky, so like if you're going on a training camp in this period, I think it's very important you don't overdo it with training, because you don't want to put yourself in that hole. So I think just if you do go on a training camp, then obviously raising the volume a bit, but not doing it by massive amounts by any means. Making sure you get that stimulus, but not enough that you come back and you're in that hole for the next 2 weeks, because then it kind of undoes all the work that you've done. I've seen athletes do this in the past, so it's just a word of warning. Just be careful around that, and be clear on what you're trying to get out of each session and in each phase.
Yeah, absolutely. I think with the training camp, one of the biggest benefits is not that you suddenly double your training volume. It's that you increase your sleep time from 7 hours per night to 10 hours per night instead. And you do bump up your volume a bit, but you keep that controlled, as you say. And with the additional sleep, then that's doable, and you can recover from that and not dig yourself into a hole. But if you suddenly go to a 25-hour week from training 9 or 10 hours, then that's probably going to take a long time to recover from. So that's actually a good lead into the next topic that we have here. So common mistakes to avoid during this phase of training. Lucky, let's start with you.
the common mistakes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think, that we've kind of covered quite a lot of them already. Sleep is obviously the number one thing at all times of a training program and just throughout life, whether or not you're an athlete. So it's something that we really need to place a high emphasis on, especially at this time of year. As I talked about before, I think that, meeting energy demand is a really big one. And I think, you have to consider that this is athlete dependent, but if we're talking someone that, let's just say, for instance, they have a 300 watt threshold on the bike, and I know we talked about this the other day, Michael, but if your LT1 is at a level and you're doing quite a lot of work there, the caloric demands of that can still be very, very high. And I think at this time of year we have to understand that and make sure that we're just meeting that energy demand that we're kind of creating. And that's, relative to how much volume you're actually doing and that kind of thing. But I think it's relevant for everyone. We don't want to be going into, that relative energy deficiency. That's where, we kind of fall into a lot of trouble for males especially. I mean, that's low testosterone, and we know for females it's, their hormones can be kind of thrown out of whack as well, and that just brings a whole bunch of problems. So we really want to avoid that. As James spoke about, really, really good time of year to make sure that, life is always a give and take. And, there are points throughout the year where you're going to be asking to kind of take a little more from whether it be family or work. And this is the time that, you have to give back a little bit. So I think that's really important. And I think that keeping that balance in life and perspective is something that we should always be striving for, kind of no matter the level of athlete, and I don't think this is the time of year to ask to take. Otherwise, it's it can lead to problems that really, I mean, you have to consider why we're doing the sport, and it's because we love training and because we love enjoying it. It's not to ruin relationships and lose our job over.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I mean, I wrote down, a very similar list to actually what you said there. So I'll just briefly go over it. My first point was, you don't want to overtrain in this period. So you don't want to overdo things. And I think we spoke about that, just a moment ago about, too much fatigue and too much chronic fatigue. You definitely don't want that from this period. The other point I have is, overcomplicating things. So I think this is an easy time of year to start thinking about things, and actually just not getting the training done. I mean, what you want from this period is just a consistency, as we've spoken about before. So, you really don't need to overcomplicate things. The third point I had on the list is, again, tying back to things we've already spoken about, is taking it too seriously and not enjoying your training. So, you like you just said, Lucky, you need to enjoy triathlon to do it. If you're not enjoying it, then there's something wrong. Maybe you shouldn't be doing it, or maybe you should be doing it slightly differently, because this is a time of year where actually, you've got to enjoy what you're doing. If you're not enjoying it, then why are you doing it? And that kind of thing. And you shouldn't be taking away from your family, and you should be maybe prioritizing other things like spending time with loved ones and that kind of thing. Obviously getting the training done and getting it done consistently, but not taking it too seriously that you stop enjoying that. And I think that is a really good point you made around the eating as well. So it is massively important you're getting enough food in, you're getting enough that you're not in an energy deficit, and going on those points about hormones and things like that. Also, I've been involved in studies where actually things like bone health are having a massive having an energy deficit really doesn't help with bone health, and and the kind of injuries that are associated with that. And same kind of thing with with muscle building. If you want to improve the amount of strength you've got and your muscular capacity, then actually under eating is not going to help you with that. So just being very aware of that at this time of year.
Yeah, look, and I'll give you just an example for myself anyway. I guess it's a little bit different here as an Australian living in Australia, but still wanting to race more to a Northern Hemisphere kind of calendar, as we're kind of dictated to with Ironman and whatnot. At this time of year, for me, say over December, is a lot of the the European cyclists come home for summer and all of that kind of jazz. So there's just a lot of opportunity to go out and do fun things. It might be a long ride, but you're stopping for half an hour halfway through to eat cake and talk rubbish, and on the way back there might be a few efforts up hills, and but you're still getting this wonderful opportunity to kind of touch on all energy systems, have fun, be out in the sun, and keeping that joy in training and just doing things for fun, I think is really important, because sometimes we lose sight of that once we get into that really race specific phase where everything's, race pace, looking for specific intervals and that kind of stuff. We can actually use opportunities, like a bunch ride or whatever it might be, where we're actually getting great stimulus, but not really doing it in such a structured sense.
100%. Yeah. That's if I go through my list a bit, that's one of my first points here. To a common mistake is to rush back into full-on training, where first of all, rushing the volume, so not taking that gradual build-up of volume that we talked about, but also rushing back into like doing a lot of really structured intervals and a lot of really hard work. To be honest, that's a common mistake, I think. Another one is looking too much at what other people are doing. Look, I think a lot of people are making a ton of mistakes, so it doesn't make sense to do necessarily the thing that your buddies are doing. They might be building their FTP and it's growing at a rapid rate, but are they going to be a January star and then burnt out in July? I think a lot of people that get too fit too soon, that's what ends up happening to them. And I think we had a perfect example here in Portugal, actually, in the Tokyo test event in the mixed relay. I think 3 out of 4 of the Portuguese athletes that actually participated in that relay were injured or coming back from injury, and they were all really fit in March when the season started here with the first races, but they just ended up getting injured. I just think that they did too much work too soon, following a lot of the training and listening to or talking with people that know what their training is like. I think that's it's not just them, it's a lot of people. I think that's happened too, but that was a sad example, because I would have wanted them to do well, obviously, since I can't really support Finland since we don't have a mixed relay team anyway, so I'm choosing to support Portugal.
And let's not forget that social media is people's biggest days and best sessions. It's not necessarily the reality of the day in, day out.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so social media, Strava, all of these things they facilitate making mistakes. So try to not let them affect what you're doing and just focus on you. And so you're not trying to be in the peak shape of your life right now. But on the flip side, as we talked about, you don't want to lose touch of all your energy systems and intensity levels for too long either. But that doesn't mean that you do your hardest work now, but you want to stay in touch with all of them. And then we talked about overtraining and management of fatigue and the chronic fatigue especially. And then 2 more points. One is not focusing on strength and conditioning and building the chassis for being robust and actually being able to handle the harder training load that will come later on. And then finally, I think that not just winging it, not planning it is a mistake, even though, as we talked about already, plans can and will and should change. You need to have flexibility, but I think plans are good starting points, and they, if you, especially, both as a coach and a self-coach athlete, I think they give you a sort of accountability. And that then if you are doing changes, you need to motivate yourself. Why am I making this change? Is this a smart change? But you also need to motivate to yourself, is this the best use of this week 2 months from now with the information that I have available at this time? And then later on, if you find new information that makes you change that week to something else, to some other theme, then that just means that, you have new information, and now you know why you think that it makes more sense to do something else, but you still had that initial sense of what might make sense to do. So you're just improving your chances of doing good, effective training. So those were most of the points that I had. And then, of course, all the other things that you already mentioned, I completely agree with them as well. So let's move on then to have the final question, actually, the final topic that I want to talk about, because I think that we can skip the sample training week that I initially wrote down here. I don't think it makes sense to do that, actually, for this episode. It's going to be so varied. So let's go with the final topic, which is outside of training. What are the other important considerations during the base training phase? And James, why don't you start?
So I think, we've touched on this already. I think outside of training, there's lots of things you can do to try and improve your performance. Obviously, the first one, away from what I just said is, just enjoying your time. So making sure you're enjoying your life, making sure that you've got a good balance, making sure that you've got consistent work-life training balance. And then away from that, so things that, are actually going to improve your performance in triathlon, but aren't necessarily training related. I'd go away and I think about things like, if you are an Ironman athlete, something like, can you be more aerodynamic? And if you think you can, you can. That's the answer to that. Go and get a bike fit. Go and get your equipment tested. Go and think about, what you're using. And then there's also, side around things like, nutrition. Are you using the best nutrition plan in racing? Are you eating well outside of training, around training, and all those things, you can go and think about and, implement around your training, and they will have a big impact on your training, but aren't necessarily training related, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't know what you've got to add to that.
Yeah, look, I tend to agree with pretty much everything you touched on. And I guess the only other thing that I would kind of add there is, we've seen this shift, especially in probably the last couple of years, just in kind of day-to-day life, but this move towards working on things like mindfulness and utilizing meditation and stuff. And I think this is a really, really good time to work on that and create a bit of a routine around it, because it is beneficial, and it is a really good opportunity while you have maybe a little bit more time to take the time to work on those skills as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Definitely. I have a couple of other things to add. I think that this is a good time to get a basic blood panel done, and I think that's something that can be beneficial to do once per year. And the base training phase, when you are in a lighter training load phase, especially, I think it makes sense to do it early on. So maybe once you get out of your season break, or in the first few weeks of that transition phase, is a good time to do that. I also think, as I mentioned already, seeing a physio to make sure, even if you are not injured, even if you have no niggles, I think that's something that is absolutely beneficial to find out if you have any imbalances or things that might end up being injuries down the line. And then, as James said, having a bike fit, that can be, even if you had one last year, for many it makes sense to have one every year. Not necessarily for everybody, but it's definitely not a bad thing. And then sleep, we already mentioned. So I think those are mostly it. That's my list. All right, guys. So this was really great. That's all I had, and I think we covered a lot. And I hope that the listeners will get a lot of value from it. Do you have anything else that you want to mention, or any final words of wisdom or take home messages for the listeners?
I just say, just make sure you're enjoying training. Enjoying triathlon. That's the most important thing, and don't make it too complicated.
Yeah, I tend to agree. Kind of assess what it is that you love about this sport, and why you do it, and make sure that you're doing it for the right reasons.
Perfect. That's a great note to end on. Thank you, and look forward to doing this again soon.
Sounds good.
So I hope that you enjoyed that episode and found it useful, and that it answered a lot of the questions that we've been getting. You can find the show notes on thattriathlonshow.com as usual. Although I should say that they might be maybe a bit late, or not quite the same style as normal, as Samantha, who usually creates the show notes, is on a well-deserved vacation. So bear with us if there's any difference compared to the normal style of the show notes. We will have links to the related episodes, the interviews with James and Lachie, in the show notes, of course, and in the podcast description. And in next Monday's episode, I interview Konrad Geringer, who I was introduced to by our mutual friend Rob Sleemaker. And thanks to that introduction, Konrad and I ended up meeting in Nice when we were there for the Ironman 7.3 World Championships, and had a great long chat, and then decided that we should record a podcast episode later on with the focus on training for time-crunched athletes, which is Konrad's specialty. So that's out next Monday, and in the meantime, as usual, there will be a Q&A episode on Thursday. So stay subscribed to the show so that you don't miss any episodes. And also, please tell a friend about it. Keep spreading the word. It really helps out. And if you haven't left a rating and a review, those are the currency of podcasts. So your effort in doing that really does matter and goes a long way to keeping the show sustainable, because there's a lot of work, both time and money, that goes into the podcast. So we need to keep growing it to keep it sustainable and realistic, to keep producing it at the current rate and quality. Big thanks to our sponsors, Roka, that you can find on roka.com. You can get 20% off your order with the promo code TTS, all caps. And thank you to Precision Hydration, that you can find on precisionhydration.com. Take their free online sweat test to get a personalized hydration strategy. And try a box or tube of electrolytes for free with the promo code That's Triathlon Show, all one word, all caps. Thank you, as always, for listening. Keep training smart and keep loving triathlon.